thank you for your invitation, Pierpaolo, for inviting me to this conference and into these amazing spaces. It's really quite breathtaking to be here. You invited me as a practicing architect, and even though I also write, I've written 1 or 2 books, I'm certainly no architectural historian. And I would like to approach our discipline always somehow through the critical lens of practice. Now, what does practice allow us to kind of use as a tool of observing our own discipline? So, to give you a sense of from where I come from, I would like to spend maybe the first half of my presentation making a brief run-through of some of the, that was supposed to be moving, of some of the projects that I've been working on, or that my office has been working on, and then specifically focus on one particular project, a recent project. And only then, in the second half of the presentation, shift to the topic of Fischer and investigate or contemplate kind of what does he offer us, what kind of understanding does he offer us today, and what kind of understanding does he offer us in terms of our kind of contemporary practice. So allow me to be a little bit self-referential in the first half of the presentation, while then stepping out into the kind of larger realm of the discipline in the second part of the presentation. I'll start with this little building that we did in Zurich. It's a residential project that in a way tries to reimagine what it means to be a facade that can eventually then fold out and be balconies. But my practice has also brought me to very faraway places, such as investigating the urban layouts and architectural production of spaces of refuge, especially in the Western Sahara and southwestern Algeria, which then turned into a national pavilion of the Western Sahara at the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago. Where we produced a series of tapestries. The carpets were representing the architectural productions in the camps by the refugees themselves, which then eventually ended up in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But we are also working in a very even corporate environment of a vast housing scheme, urban redevelopment scheme, 200 apartments in Cologne, which are currently under construction, a very dense kind of almost again tapestry of housing on a very small scale of small, let's say, infill site, which investigated the legal dimension of our architectural profession. Half of it is legal, the other half is in a way illegal. And the very tiny scale of furniture that can dance, and then again taking us out into different spheres and continents, investigating and documenting the architectural production on the African continent during the era of decolonization, where an amazing architectural oeuvre was built that is hardly known in the West. That we've documented, and I was really thankful to Dubravka also for showing this much more in depth. I had the fortunate opportunity to visit many of the Energo projects in Lusaka, in Nigeria, in Uganda, that you were showing, and that enabled me also to be active as a practitioner on the African continent, in Senegal, in eastern Senegal, building a maternity and pediatric hospital that is all based on this kind of perforated brick that allows the building to be naturally ventilated without the use of air conditioning, but also has the wonderful benefit of turning the building at 8 a.m. in the morning into a disco ball. kind of here shown over the fantastic kind of urban landscape of Tambacounda, one of the hottest large cities on the African continent in eastern Senegal. I would like, though, to focus a little bit longer on a project that is very dear to me and that maybe shows what my practice also tries to achieve, which is a certain kind of questioning or challenging of certain kind of categories and definite thinking models let's say categories of architecture and somehow undermine them. And it's on one hand a certain timely project, it's also a certain, in a way, a very tragic project. It's in Kiev, in the Ukraine. It was just completed half a year ago. It's a synagogue for an area called Babin Yar, which is the site of one of the worst massacres of the 20th century, where when the Nazis in September 1941 invaded Kiev, a few days later, September 29th, 1941, demanded that all Jews march to the very west of the city, at the then edge of the city, and within 2 days, 34,000 Jews were shot, were killed. So in a way, a topography of death was created through the mass killing. It's an area that is very much contoured. It has ravines, deep ravines, and not even mass graves needed to be dug out because the use of ravines, they were just filling up with corpses. So October 2020, I was commissioned to design a synagogue on this very place, on this very location. So everything that you see here is in a way literally and metaphorically growing out of death. And it was on one hand a huge kind of honor to build on this, one of the darkest spots of European history, but also a huge responsibility. And I thought, no, the kind of initial thought that went through my head was, maybe it should be something very somber. It should be something very heavy. But then I thought, this is almost a stupid equation. No, we, as architects, when we do commemorative buildings, memorial buildings to dark points of our history, we try to almost equate the weight of the crime with the weight of the architecture. If the crime is so heavy, then we have to do architecture that is also very heavy, hence in concrete or in stone. And I thought this was wrong. I wanted to do something which in a way is very different. Try to approach this notion of monumentality, monument, a commemorative architecture and a synagogue through a very different kind of lens. And then I thought, what is actually a synagogue? Maybe it's a naive question, but what do we do when we go to a synagogue? First of all, we always go with a group of people. A synagogue doesn't work with a single people. You have to be a minimum group of 10. And then you go to the synagogue and you open a book together. It's the book of prayers. And this book unfolds a million stories, histories, morals, narratives, laws, and so on. And it's a kind of a new universe of stories. And in a way, this is exactly what happens when we open up these wonderful little pop-up books that we, in a way, like quite a lot. I guess nobody can really refuse or resist the temptation of opening these pop-up books when we see them in, I don't know, museum bookstores or so on. And in a way, they do the same. We poke our nose into them and they take us into a new universe of stories and storytelling that we can get lost in. It's, in a way, what happens in a synagogue. So I thought, let's do exactly that. Let's do a building, a synagogue, that opens up, that unfolds into a space of its own. It's not a small building, it's 100 square meters large, and it's exactly what we then designed. We also wanted to reference wonderful architectural history, difficult term in today's conference, or historic production of synagogue architecture from the 16th, 17th, 18th century of Western Ukraine that looked like this, that had all been destroyed during the Second World War, that was amazingly decorated from the inside. They were all wooden buildings, and they were all hand-painted with iconography, symbolism, and flowers and words. So they looked like this, and I thought this is magic in a way to use all these flowers. So what we did was we used that as a kind of motifs on the interior of the building, and on the ceiling we designed a kind of a layout of a night sky, where every star is represented as a flower, and every flower is a star. And it's exactly the star constellation that was visible over the night sky over Kiev on September 29th, 1941. It's basically the last thing that the Jews saw before they were shot. And this was then eventually painted, hand-painted onto the ceiling. The building was completed in the shortest of time, and inaugurated in a series of inaugurations in late spring and early autumn 2021. It was, before the war, used daily as a synagogue, which was for me very beautiful, because as a commemorative building, it's not just commemorative, but it brings back Jewish life to the very place where it was eradicated exactly 80 years previously. It actually does open, it does move. It's a hugely complicated structure. And I show this image. It shows my wonderful, beautiful wife and our fantastic, beautiful son, Max, and me. And I don't show this out of vanity, but I show this because it's something very important to me. When I was commissioned in October 2020, my son had just been born. My wife gave birth to little Max. And I was reading on the kind of literature, eyewitness reports of the massacre and constructed eyewitness reports of the massacre. So I was reading about some of the deepest, darkest, most terrible kind of dimensions that we as human beings are capable of committing, and at the same time looking into the beautiful eyes of my fantastic boy and seeing how happy he is to be alive, how much he was enjoying to be alive. And I thought this teaches me that the building cannot be about, or cannot only be about death. It has to celebrate the beauty of life. And that's what it tries to do. I will kind of fast forward this. It's a physical process. It takes power. It takes a lot of people to open it up. It's a manual process. It's not a fast process. It's a kind of a new ritual that we bring. It's also a little bit of a spectacle, of course. Kind of making visible what is usually often hidden or understood as being hidden behind walls, what is actually a synagogue. I'll fast forward this a little bit. You kind of erect the main column. You draw out the reading platform, the praying platform, the balcony for the women. Women in Orthodox synagogues sit separately from men, and then that's it. That's your synagogue. It was inaugurated early October 2021. Somehow these photos, the Ukrainian, Israeli, and German president, they seem almost from another era. On the very first days of the war, it was hit, not the building, but the site of Babin was hit by rockets. 5 people died 150 meters away from the synagogue, and it is, of course, absurd and terrible and tragic that the site of one of the worst massacres becomes again a site of killing. The synagogue, as far as we know, is so far undamaged, but this is maybe, considering the loss of life, the least of our kind of concerns. But somehow what I try to do is create a synagogue that is unlike any other synagogue, though maybe goes to the very core of what it means to be a synagogue. It's a commemorative building unlike any other commemorative buildings. It's made out of the kind of most fragile materials, but it maybe goes to the very core of what it means to be commemorative. When I received the invitation to come here and participate in this conference, I was very happy, and to my, let's say, embarrassment, I must admit that I didn't know the book of Fischer, his Entwurff. But when I had looked at it, Pier Paolo sent me his text, and of course the book itself, I felt immediately drawn to it. I felt immediately a certain kind of sympathy and connection. First of all, there's this attempt to act virtually globally. And of course, all the images you've seen before, I'm just, and everything that I'm saying is in a way repetition to the wonderful presentations that we've seen in the morning. But I just want to stress what kind of I was touched by. It is this kind of attempt to put architecture of Rome, ancient Britain, China, and Egypt, just to name a few, on the same platform. And this, I think, is a statement that I felt very much drawn to. Of course, we can debate the selection. Why is, for example, Eastern Europe left out? Why are the Americas missing? But we know, of course, that any kind of selection is always arbitrary and is always also based on personal preferences. But the very fact that classical Roman architecture, a Siamese bridge, or a small mosque from a Turkish village are put on eye level with each other is something I have great sympathy for. It's the acknowledgement of cultural achievement that attempts to go beyond Western Europe, the Western European realm. And of course we could add now, or could say now, if we are really critical, that even in the way that it is done, it is still kind of based on European prejudices and a European perspective and a European lens. But I think that would be a bit of a wise-assy kind of critique of it, and I really value that kind of statement and message to put a cistern in Constantinople and the Jerusalem temple on the same level. I think that's a very important statement to make. And then, when we flip through the pages, you come across an almost absurdly grand range of architectural projects, such as the temple, Chinese pagodas, the named cistern, which is in a way technical urban infrastructure, no? Kind of sewage canals, voluptuous Egyptian vases, and many, many, many more typologies, from bridges to urban townhouses to artificial islands. And as much as we should, and maybe attempt to construct a coherency, construct a reading, what brings them together, what are the chapters, what are the references, what is the kind of red line, what is the storyline that Fischer is telling us. I think we will always at least partially fail in that, and I think that's what makes it rich. It is exactly these kind of idiosyncrasies that the exceptions, where he kind of steps out of any kind of perceived logic, that is so wonderful about this book, and that I think tell us something. I would like to juxtapose Fischer's book with another book, and it's, in this case, it's a literary work. Because I think that there's a productive tension that emerges through the juxtaposition of Fischer's book with that particular book of literature. That particular book was written exactly kind of halfway between the 300 years that we're celebrating now and our contemporary time. And I don't know, maybe it's obvious or no, maybe you've guessed it, it's Gustave Flaubert's Bouvard et Pécuchet. Bouvard et Pécuchet is often described as a satirical novel. It is Flaubert's last work. It was published incomplete after his death. And just to kind of briefly recount, and forgive me if this is kind of common knowledge, the book tells the story of two friends, Bouvard and Pécuchet, living in Paris. And both are working as accountants. They spend their days counting numbers, organizing data, organizing information, in a way organizing their world. It's, let's say, an urban and a bureaucratic occupation. And when one of the two men inherits a sizable fortune, they decide to change their lives fundamentally. They decide to move out to the countryside, buy a large piece of land in a Normandy village, and start with a completely new life's endeavor. And this new endeavor is very courageous and in a way is completely outrageous. What they want to do is to learn about every science that is somehow available to them. Every science that they can get their hands on. All the natural science, the science of the humanities, religion, pedagogy. They learn about agriculture, chemistry, anatomy, medicine, biology, literature, drama, politics, love, gymnastics, theology, pedagogy, and architecture. But Bouvard and Pécuchet not only want to learn about chemistry, medicine, archaeology, and so on, or the science of love, it's, don't know what it hints to, but they also want to very quickly become practitioners in these very fields. And usually they fail at that, of course. So, for example, they learn about pedagogy and immediately open a school in that village and try to educate the young kids of that village and fail or stumble over their own overexcitement in trying to apply the newest techniques of pedagogy in their school. Usually, the book of Bouvard and Pécuchet is seen as a certain kind of investigation into epistemology and also a critique of the distance between human experience and technical sciences. But I think we can also see the book as offering two very different models of organizing knowledge. There are two lives to Bouvard and Pécuchet, and these two lives embody and personalize, in a way, two radically different models of gaining, collecting, and organizing knowledge. Their first life as accountants is about a very precise way of copying and sorting data and numbers. The world is represented by numbers. It's about knowing very much about very little. It's about knowing absolutely in depth everything about a super narrow part of the world. And it's about understanding the world as clearly separated between practice and theory, between the interior world of their office and the exterior world where all these numbers are coming from, which they, in a way, don't need to know anything about. In their second life, they adopt the practice of gathering, of foraging, collecting from sciences as broad as possible. They intentionally merge theory and practice. They confuse signifier and signified. And they know very little about very much. It's a world kind of represented by ideas. And if for a moment we ignore that the two men mostly fail in their endeavors and in their practice of scientific investigation, maybe what the book of Bouvard and Pécuchet, and maybe what this proposal of two models of knowledge systems offers us or allows us is in a way the very critique of that first model, the very critique of that model that I think can also be described as a certain kind of professionalism or specialist's approach to our world. And maybe offering as an alternative a more generalist's understanding of our world and of knowledge system. And I believe that this has profound impact on how we understand our own discipline of architecture and how I would like to understand myself, my practice, or our overall practice of architecture. A little excursion, I like this image very much. It's Georges Perec, another French author, who he wrote this fantastic book, Life, a User's Manual, but beyond that, he made for himself a kind of a plan for his life, which was to write every kind of text once. So once a criminal story, once a cooking recipe, once a crossword puzzle, once a love novella. And I think this kind of project for life is very kind of insightful, and it connects, I would claim, Flaubert and Fischer. I would claim that what Fischer shows and teaches us is that there can be a great value in a certain kind of generalist's or even amateur's view. And I don't want to use the word amateurs in a negative sense, but in the most positive sense that we can imagine, in an amateur's view of our architecture. How do we make sense of the world is not necessarily or not only by becoming a great expert in a very narrow and specialized subfield of our discipline, but rather in emphasizing the generalist dimension of our discipline. I would like to claim that what both Fischer and Flaubert offer us is, in a way, to recover the value of again, in the most positive sense that we can imagine, the enthusiast dabbler or the enthusiast dilettante. The enthusiast dilettante within the practice of architecture. I have incredible respect for architects who become kind of masters in one typology. Now we know these architects who produce the most beautiful university buildings for all of their career, or the most beautiful museums for all of their career. But to be very honest, it also scares me. And I think when we look at the pressures of the market and finance, the pressures of the media, the pressures of rules and regulations, and the pressures of our own disciplinary bodies like RIBA and so on, they all push us into this kind of specialization, hyper-specialization. If we would hypothetically read Fischer's book, not as a constructed documentary of mostly found architecture, but rather, as it were, as a documentation of his own architectural production. So this is the output of his office. Then an image of a truly radical architectural practice would emerge. It would be an architectural practice that designs vases, urban infrastructure, townhouses, artificial islands, mosques, bridges and cisterns, sewage canals. And it is an architectural practice that treats them all with the same level of respect and curiosity. It is this kind of radical practice that I find fascinating myself, and as we are speaking here in an academic environment, it's a kind of position that I would love to convey to students in these kinds of institutions. Thank you for your attention.